than you thought. Well, that's the situation I've got right now. So let's just go do some history. A couple of weeks ago, I decided that I would deal with something called identity. I would, do a couple of weeks about what it was like to what the secular idea of identity is, and then what the Christian idea of identity is. And then, I had a couple of basic ideas about, two different spectrums over which I would deal with these things. And then we'd have a pretty good idea of identity. And then I realized it's a heck of a lot more complicated than I thought. Added to that, about a week ago, I, realized that this was going to be a little bit more difficult. And so I took a week off and figured I'd do some quick work to try and understand what was going on. And then COVID-19 decided to wreak havoc on my home province. And we're now all in very deep lockdown right now. And added to that, I went and did something dumb on Friday afternoon, slipped on some ice on my driveway, and ended up with, well, a non-working leg. So as a result, there's been a lot going on in my life. So in all honesty, this is going to mean that I'm going to have to take a little bit longer to deal with the question of identity. First, it's harder. And second of all, I've got less time that I can actually really put into it. But it's an important topic. It's a topic that I think is pretty central to the way that society, culture, and especially the Christian church is going to be dealing with the world around us and even ourselves. And I think it's got some very important implications for the way we read the Bible and the way we live our Christian lives. So I still think I'm going to do this, but I'm going to ask you guys to be a little bit more patient with me because it's probably going to be hard. And so with that in mind, uh, basically, I'm going to be doing what I think a teacher should do. So I was taught that a teacher is someone who learns in public. So basically, what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of weeks when I do these Tuesday night things on identity, I'm going to be learning publicly about what I think identity is. So I'm going to be kind of feeling around in these ideas. I'm going to be applying scripture to the ideas that I find in other places, and I'm going to hopefully come to a better understanding overall. So by God's grace, this will be a great thing for you guys to watch, because at the very least, it might be a lot like a train wreck, and you might not be able to turn your eyes away. In any case, thank you for joining me today. Thank you, John Lewis, for saying good evening, and thank you for giving me yet another greeting, John Troke. By the way, John Troke will probably be joining me on Thursday night later on, because we have a prayer meeting for our local church first, but later on we'll be discussing the question of unconditional election on Thursday afternoon or Thursday evening. But in any case, that's further on down the road. In any case, in case you don't know me, my name is Steve Daw. I am an elder at Calvary Baptist Church here in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. I say here, I'm actually in Paradise, but the church is in St. John's, Newfoundland, and that's where I work as an elder and as the director of education for an organization called Mile One Mission. And Mile One Mission desires to plant gospel-centered churches, healthy gospel-centered churches here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And by God's grace, we're going to do that. And if you have any questions or concerns, or you want to give me some heads up or things that I should be looking forward to or into when it comes to the question of identity, you can drop me a line at steve.daw@mileonemission.ca. Or you can drop me a line at steve@considering828.org. Both are going to get to me. I just like having a lot of different email addresses. Anyway, so you'll remember a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the question of identity. And I said that there was going to be a couple of different viewpoints that I wanted to deal with this. And I'm still going to want to deal with them from these viewpoints. First of all, I want to see whether or not what we're talking about when we talk about an identity, this is how somebody sees themselves, whether an identity is something that you discover or whether it's something you construct. And second of all, whether you discover it or construct it from stuff you see inside yourself or from stuff that comes outside yourself. So, I mean, it's kind of a philosophical way of viewing things. Occupational hazard. My first degree was, in fact, philosophy. So I'm kind of used to philosophizing. I don't think I've ever really gotten over that first degree. So, in any case, uh, I hope you guys can join me in this. In any case, I think what's going to be necessary right now then is to deal with the question of what an identity is. What are we talking about in any case? And that sounds like a really simple question. What is identity? It's a pretty basic question. Well, I've learned over my many years that simple questions sometimes don't have very simple answers. And oftentimes your answer is going to hide more than it actually lets you know. I'll give you an example here. This is from Peter Weinreich. This is from Wikipedia, basically. And this is what one guy says an identity is. A person's identity is defined as the totality of one's self-construal, in how which one construes oneself in the present expresses the continuity between how one construes himself as one was in the past and how one construes oneself as one aspires to be in the future. That's a lot of words, but the idea here is that the person that you are, the person that you are on as an identity, is something that is basically how you see yourself, how you construe yourself. Um, do you understand? Do you think you are this kind of a person, or you are this other kind of a person? Barbara Ann points out that she's actually dealing with something slightly different here. She's working through identity spectrums based on diversity and inclusion studies, which is going to be an interesting stuff. But there are going to be some basic assumptions that are going to be in there that I'm not sure I'm going to be completely agreeing with. Again, I'm just dealing with this from my own perspective. I'm learning in public just like you guys. In any case, the one thing that I noticed though about this basic definition that I see here on Wikipedia, besides being complicated and difficult to understand, is that it's all very internal. It's very self-focused. It's also very strangely enough subjective. And by subjective, just to give you a basic understanding of what we're talking about there, when we say that something is subjective, we mean that it's defined by a subject, a person who is experiencing it. So a subjective thing would be, I don't know, I like ice cream. That's a subjective valuance of ice cream. Um, I feel, I believe. These are all subjective statements. Now, there are subjective statements that can be based on something that's true. I believe that my name is Steve Daw. Well, I am Steve Daw. That actually is an objective fact. My belief in that, though, is my subjective experience of the objective fact. What we're seeing here is that basically, when we're talking about selfhood or identity, when it comes to the situations that we're dealing with in the world around us, identity seems to be something that oftentimes, at least in the modern world, is defined, developed, understood in a subjective sense. It's about how you construe yourself. It's reflexively subjective. And I'm not sure that that's going to be actually useful. So I did a bit of reading and I did some examination of some other ideas around it. And I was reading a guy named Charles Taylor. By the way, the book that I'm going to be referring to is this one. It's a huge book. I haven't read the whole thing. I have actually skimmed large sections of it. But I was actually pointed to it by another book by a guy named Carl Truman, more recent book. And I actually have read this one. But it's what I've been finding is that there's actually, and this is what Charles Taylor would say is the basic idea of identity, of who you are, that there are sources of ourselves. There are sources of how we see ourselves. And historically speaking, they've developed over time. And these three ideas, these three concepts, are things that all work together in the modern world to develop who we see what we understand as this concept of identity. So, first one is what we saw there in the first definition. Who we are by identity is who we internally understand ourselves to be. So, at some sense, who I am, what my identity is something that's defined first and foremost by the way that understand myself to be, at least from the modern perspective of things. Now, I'm not sure that this is going to fit very well within a Christian context, but we'll deal with that in a minute. But this is the first and the foremost part. I am who I believe myself to be, at least at some level. But the second one is going to be how we live in ordinary, as in an ordinary life, who we live as in ordinary life. So, for example, I may believe myself to be the king of Spain. I'd be insane if I believed that, but I could, in fact, believe that I am the king of Spain. But I live as a middle-aged single pastor in St. John's, Newfoundland. You'll notice this by the fact that you see me going to a church office from time to time. I read the Bible fairly regularly. I start doing a whole bunch of things that seem pastory. Uh, I am I am acting out as a single man. I don't have a wife living with me, so that would be another part of it. My ordinary life is working in these ways to kind of help define who I am as a person. And this is going to be important in a lot of ways because this who we live as is going to be important for the way that we see identity, at least again in modern understanding of what an identity is. Finally, Taylor would say that identity or the self is also defined by how we express ourselves to be based on an internal, natural, moral source. So it's not merely how we understand ourselves or how we live in the world, but it's also something expressive about that experience that we have in ourselves. It's not merely the rational understanding of who we are, as would be true in the first place, but also how I express myself to be. So, in this point, it makes expression very important in who we are as people. Now, this is going to be really, really kind of important when it comes to how I deal with the two questions that I came up with last time to deal with when it comes to identity. First of all, I wanted to ask, is our identity merely known internally or constituted internally? So when I say that I am who I think myself to be, am I does that come from me knowing it internally, or is it actually constituted from by that knowledge? Is it am I saying something that I have come up with, discovered, or is it something that I am constructing? Is it something that, generally speaking, is something that I see objectively? There's an objective thing out there, or is it something that I'm actually constructing by my actually expressing it? Essentially, I'm asking, is our identity discovered or constructed? Is it an objective thing or is it a subjective thing? Is it a thing out in the world? Is it a thing that I can be wrong about? Is it something that I can be corrected about? Or is it something that I can't be corrected about because, in essence, the only one who defines my identity is me? Now, this is going to be interesting for a Christian because Christians have pretty clear answers on these questions. You see, there are Christian sources of selfhood. There are Christian bases, definitions of what it is to be a person, where we get our definition of who we are. Not merely who we are generally as humans, but who we are specifically as, say, for example, well, in my case, Steve Daw. First of all, and this is going to be kind of parallel to the first one, it's not merely how I perceive myself to be. In essence, for a Christian, our identity is based in how we relate to God. Are we in Christ or in Adam? Are we people that are defined by our bases in being sinful humans or being redeemed humans through Christ. This is going to be what you see in Romans chapter 5 and First Corinthians 15 when it talks about our identity. Is your identity found in Christ or in Adam? So that's the first kind of interesting viewpoint on where it is we are in uh, as selves. The second one is going to be something akin to our how we live out in our ordinary lives. You see, there's something that you see in the Bible over and over again, namely that the way we live kind of expresses how we are, who we are. This is where you run into the whole example of fruit that you see throughout all the entirety of Scripture. Jesus would say that by your fruits you shall know them. Well, by the things that they do, you know where they are spiritually. In Matthew chapter 20, in Matthew chapter 25, you see places where Jesus talks about, the sheep and the goats. And the definition between the sheep and the goats is not their beliefs. It's not how they see themselves in relation to God. It's how they've reacted in relation to the world around them because of who they are in God. You see this again in the book of James, when James is talking about the question of whether or not uh, faith can save. He says, well, how are you actually going to say that you have faith if you don't live in accordance with that faith? You see, your faith works out in some way. The things that you believe, the things that you think about the world, the things that you think, especially about yourself and who you are, affect the way you deal with the world around you. And so this is going to be a Christian source of the self. When we say that we have an identity, our identity is partly shown in the way that we work out our salvation with fear and trembling. So there's a sense in where there's a parallel here. But finally, we are who we were made to be, and that's in two levels when it comes to the Christian viewpoint. We were created first and foremost in the image of God. That is a focus, a central point, a basis of who a Christian is as a form of identity. You are made in the image of God. That is an objective fact, at least within a Christian worldview. You have been made for a purpose. The standard trope that Christians sometimes talk about, God has a wonderful plan for your life. Well, yes, he does. And in this sense, our identity is something objective. It is something defined outside of ourselves. It is something based in the way that God has created us. So there's going to be so then we go back to our two original questions that I had. Is our identity merely known internally or is it constituted internally? So when we're trying to find out this thing identity in a Christian context, are we talking about something that we come to know or are we creating something? Is it something that we can be wrong about? And you see, here's the thing. I think that based on all of these apparently convoluted and interesting ideas, the world will tell us that we can define who we are. That there are things that are built in here that help us to understand who we are, but we can define who we are and that we can come to conclusions about who we are. Now they have those things can be constructed based on things that are naturally true of us. My attractions, my aptitudes, my desires, the things I enjoy, the things I don't enjoy. Those are kind of constituent parts. But in essence, the world is going to say that I can construct my identity based on those things, and that's well, the way that we would deal with this. Remember when I was starting this whole thing, we talked about the court case Obergefell versus I can't remember anyway, the U.S. court case about gay marriage. And one of the things that in the majority decision that they said is that everyone has the right to define their own identity, which seems kind of strange until you understand that the idea here is that identity for this viewpoint is not an objective fact. It's something that's constructed of objective facts, but it itself is not an objective fact, at least not for the individual. It's something that's constructed by the individual. It's it is a subjective truth, I guess would be the way that they would put it. So there's no way that you could be told that you're wrong about it. But here's the problem. The Bible tends to tell us that you can actually be wrong about your identity. You can be incorrect about who you are. You can be incorrect about the things that you think define you and make you true. If, for example, you as a human believe that you are meaningless, you're wrong. That is not a matter of opinion. You were created with a meaning. That is the Christian message. If the Christian message is true, if Jesus Christ really is who he said he is, if God is who he claims to be, and he is, then you were created in his image, and you were created in his image for a purpose. And so it really doesn't matter if you think that you're valueless. You're wrong. It's going to be interesting because there's going to be a lot of things about that when it comes to the identity, the constituent parts of your identity that are going to then be centrally questionable. You can be corrected on your identity. Now, this is going to be a huge problem for the way that we deal as Christians in the world, because the fact is that's not what the way the world seems to see it. The world seems to believe, or well, regular society seems to believe, that selfhood is something that we negotiate ourselves and then we construct. I, in my living through the world, I discover things about myself, and with those things that I discover about myself, I can construct the identity that I want to be seen as, that I want to see myself as. And as I define this identity that I want to be seen as, and that I see myself as, well, that is my identity. That is who I am. There is nothing above this that can question or change the viewpoint of my identity. And that seems to be very powerful. And it is in some ways. I mean, it's essentially what every Disney movie will tell us. You can be what you want to be. However you feel is going to help you to understand who you are. And that feels very good while you can do it. The problem is going to come in when we find things about our identity, we discover things about ourselves that aren't quite as positive, things that we don't like, things that we wish weren't true. You can either deny them and say that they're not part of your identity, you can accept them as if they are part of your identity, or you can get kind of depressed about it and start wondering about who you really are. I think this is actually what kind of happens with people who end up identifying themselves with their jobs, for example. Their jobs become who they are. And because their job is who they are, when they lose their job or their job ceases to be as meaningful as it once was, either because, I don't know, technology advances some ways and so your job becomes redundant, or because your job you can't do your job as well as you once did anymore, well, then you lose your identity, if that is what in fact defines your identity. And of course, the question then is going to be, were you simply an unwise person in constructing your identity this way? Or were you simply wrong and that wasn't your identity? That isn't who you are. The world's message is going to be, this is modern secular society's message is going to be, well, you can construct your identity in poor ways and unwise ways, but it's still the identity you've constructed. So I can't really question you about your identity. Whereas the Christian message is your identity is who God says you are. Ultimately, God defines your identity. You don't. This is going to be a big, big issue. And so this is what I want to actually deal with over the next couple of weeks, at least in these Tuesday night things. First of all, I want to talk about what it means to be what it means in selfhood. Is selfhood something that you discover, or is it something that you actually construct? But second of all, I'm going to actually be asking: is your selfhood something that you can be wrong about, or something that you can be corrected on? I think the answer is going to be pretty simple. I think it's going to be fairly direct that way, but I think it's going to be very important because I think there are implications here. There are very simple implications to these issues, and they play into all sorts of major issues that we're dealing with in the society as it is generally. For example, if I get to define who I am, if I am ultimately the ultimate arbiter or constructor of my identity, then, well, I have absolute authority over everything about myself. I am the ultimate authority in whether I should live or die. This is where you get euthanasia arguments. I get to have ultimate authority about my sexual expression. And if I don't have the ability to express my expression, then of course you are making damage to my identity. And if you question my identity, if this is true about the way that my identity is, if I am the ultimate arbiter, and if you question my identity, you've actually attacked me because you've attacked something that is in fact true about me. So this is going to be a pretty important, pretty interesting argument. But alternatively, too, I think there's going to be a very important fact about this. You see, if we aren't, if God really did make us, if God really is the one who rules over all things, if God really does care deeply about who we are and did create us for a purpose, well, ultimately we don't live for ourselves. Ultimately speaking, our lives aren't defined by whether or not we've decided to be one way or another. Your life is defined by the fact that God has made you. So when I say that you are valuable, I mean that objectively. It doesn't matter if anybody else sees your value. You are valuable. If you are created in the image of God, you are the image of God. You are in the imago Dei, whether I think I like you or not. And so I think there's a freedom that comes from the Christian viewpoint that I don't think is available within a worldly viewpoint. And so I think this question of identity is going to be useful. Again, I'm not really sure that I'm getting close to where I want to talk about this. But I think that this is an important question, so I'm grasping here at the dark to try and figure out where I'm going. In any case, I've pretty much burned up my time now, so I'm gonna leave it at that. I think this has been a little bit more uh, uh, speculative than I would like it to have been. But next week, hopefully, I'll have a handle on it, and I will have thought this through a little bit better as I deal with is who you are defined inside you or outside you? Is it something that you feel in yourself, or is it something that comes outside from society? And so that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Is this from inside you or from outside you? And yeah, it is. John tells me that this is a very philosophically deep topic, and it is. It really is. But I think it's a very important topic, and that's why I'm not going to try not to leave this to the philosophers, because this is something that really does have implications for our lives. So for next week, like I said, I'm going to ask the simple question: is identity defined inside or outside? And if you want to join me, you can. Just to let you know, I do still do a far more pedestrian Bible study in the mornings. I do a quick devotional in the mornings, about 15 minutes. So you can join me tomorrow morning. I will again be doing that uh, because I enjoy doing them. We are going right now through the book of Romans, chapter 8, and so if you want to join me, that you can. You can. There are devotions that are done by Stephen Bray at 10:30 in the mornings as well. Those are also done every day by him. I do these events Tuesdays and Thursday evenings. This one I do basically my pontifications on viewpoints, and then on Thursday I will discuss questions that I've received. And if you want to join me for those, you can. You can. In any case, thank you very much for showing up tonight. I hope that this is at least was somewhat valuable. I guess I will see you later. Have a great day.